The Apostle Paul, the man whose letters shaped Christian sexual ethics for 2,000 years, never once said that the purpose of sex was to have children. He wished nobody would get married at all. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 7 through 8. I wish that all were as I myself am. It is well for them to remain unmarried as I am. Paul's own words versus what people think Paul said. That's the gap we're exploring today. So let's look at what Paul wrote, starting with the letter that sparked this whole conversation. 1 Corinthians is a response. The Corinthian church wrote to Paul with questions, and one statement they included was, "It is well for a man not to touch a woman." Paul doesn't reject this. He agrees with it in principle. This is a dialogue. Paul answering real questions from a real community, not a sermon delivered in a vacuum. Here's Paul's logic. Step by step, his ideal, celibacy for everyone. Chapter 7, verses 7 and 8, he states it plainly, but he's a realist. Verse 2, because of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. Marriage is a concession, a fallback for those who can't maintain self-control. Then comes the famous line in verse 9, "It is better to marry than to burn." We'll come back to what burn means. It's not what you think. But notice what's missing from this entire argument. Paul never mentions children, not once. Procreation plays zero role in his reasoning. Marriage exists for one purpose in Paul's framework, to manage sexual desire. That's it. Now here's something remarkable. Verse 4. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. This is reciprocity, mutual authority flowing in both directions. In the first century Mediterranean world, a husband's authority over his wife's body was assumed, and that was baseline. But Paul adds the reverse. The wife holds equal authority over the husband's body. For his time and place, this is extraordinary. Neither spouse outranks the other, both have identical claims. Remember this symmetry, because later authors writing under Paul's name will erase it completely. Compare that with the pastoral epistles, 1 Timothy and Titus, letters that claim Paul's name but were almost certainly written after his death by different authors. This was a common ancient practice called pseudepigraphy. These later letters replaced Paul's reciprocity with strict hierarchy. Wives submit, women stay silent, and marriage becomes mandatory rather than a concession. But there's a layer here that most modern readers miss entirely, and it has to do with ancient medicine. When Paul says, "It is better to marry than to burn," most people assume burn means burn in hell. It doesn't. The Greek verb is pyrousthai, to be on fire. And in the ancient Greek and Roman medical tradition, erotic desire was understood as a literal physical condition, a heating of the body. Physicians like Galen and Soranus wrote about desire as a disease, a pathological overheating that required treatment. Paul isn't using a metaphor. He's drawing on a medical framework his audience would have recognized immediately. In this medical framework, desire works like a fever. The body heats up. Left untreated, the condition worsens. The person burns. The prescribed remedy, controlled sexual release within marriage, not pleasure, not intimacy, not bonding. Treatment. This reframes Paul's entire argument. Marriage isn't a blessing or a gift, it's a prescription. And Paul's ideal in the truly healthy state is sex without desire. Intercourse within marriage performed solely to extinguish the burning, not to enjoy it. This is a radically ascetic position, and it's right there in the text once you understand the medical language behind it. An earlier letter confirms this pattern. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, Paul tells men to control their vessel, in Greek, skouos. Scholars debate what vessel means here. Some read it as the man's own body or genitalia. Others read it as a reference to the man's wife. But notice, either reading leads to the same conclusion. Paul instructs them to act not in passion of desire like the Gentiles. The target isn't wrong behavior. The target is desire itself. So let's crystallize this. Paul is not anti-marriage. He is not anti-sex. He is anti-desire. Marriage is permitted. Sex within marriage is permitted. But the wanting, the burning, the craving, that is the disease Paul wants to cure. Most modern readers miss this distinction entirely. So if this is what Paul taught, why do so many churches teach something so different? The answer lies in letters that claim to be from Paul, but almost certainly aren't. The pastoral epistles, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and the Titus, dramatically revise his teaching. Women will be saved through childbearing. 1 Timothy 2:15 declares, hierarchical household codes replace reciprocity. Marriage shifts from concession to requirement. Procreation, absent from Paul's argument, becomes central to women's identity and salvation. This isn't just ancient history. Modern debates about biblical marriage, gender roles, and sexuality routinely cite Paul. But which Paul? The Paul of 1 Corinthians 7, who wished everyone was celibate and taught mutual bodily authority, or the Paul of the pastoral epistles, who mandated female submission and tied salvation to childbearing? Recognizing these as different voices within the New Testament changes the conversation entirely. Paul didn't think marriage was sacred. He thought it was useful, a fire extinguisher for a body that wouldn't stop burning. And that's a very different foundation than the one most people assume.